when I was a kid. It's pretty difficult to put together a list of favorite animated films since I have seen so many, but here is a list of movies that were very influential to me as a very little kid. So this week is my top 5 animated films from my childhood. Now, I'm not going to be including any Disney titles on this list because if I did that, this would have to be like a top 20 list or something. But you can go ahead and assume that, of course, Disney movies were a very huge part of my childhood. I'm also not going to be including the animated Hobbit since I talked about it already and very recently, but it would top this list completely. With those out of the way, let's get started.
Time flies by in the city of light. Time stands still in the country. There's no time for a fuss and a fight as we travel the land.
The Brave Little Toaster is one of those kids' movies that almost everyone I know grew up with. The antics of a bunch of household appliances as they try to reunite with the owner, interspersed with a lot of weird songs and some surprisingly terrifying situations. This movie is a little hard to analyze because looking back on it now, this was a really, really weird and dark movie. Many of my friends can point to this movie as being the reason they now have a lifelong fear of clowns. But for some reason I loved it. Lots of parts of it terrified me, but I loved it in spite of, or maybe because of that. And actually the character of the little toaster himself, is a very admirable and brave character. And I think it was his eventual sacrifice that really spoke to me. Of course, it spawned a couple of really awful sequels, but this movie was very good.
There's a power in every breath. There's a power in every note. A power that starts within the heart. A power that rises through the throat.
I don't know too many other people who have ever heard of this movie, but this was always one of my absolute favorites. The Princess and the Goblin is based on a novel by George MacDonald and is set in a medieval fantasy setting. The story centers around the adventures the Princess Irene and her friend Curdie get into concerning the goblins, and how they help to stave off an attack from the goblins against the city. Looking back, movies like this are what really made me love fantasy from a very young age. For a kids' movie, it does a pretty good job of immersing the viewer in another world. Now, the goblins are all ridiculous as all get out, and the animation is, well, really pretty bad. But this is one of those movies that I'll just never get tired of. I think I also really liked it because when I was introduced to this movie, I was just at the age where I was able to recognize things like allegories and symbolisms. And I was very excited that this movie had a little bit more depth to it than other kids' movies.
Serendipity-doo, serendipity-dee.
Wow, what a wonderful world we'd have if we all could be loving and caring, giving and sharing, like my friend Serendipity.
I flipping loved this movie. Serendipity, the Pink Dinosaur is loosely based on the classic children's picture book series. The story is about a young boy named Bobby who becomes separated from his parents during an Antarctic expedition and eventually drifts on the back of a giant egg to Paradise Island, where the egg hatches and reveals an ancient dinosaur, Serendipity. From there on, it's a series of their various adventures together on Paradise Island and battles against the wicked Captain Smudge. There was just something about this movie that absolutely enchanted me as a kid, and I'm not sure exactly what it was. Maybe it was the pretty anime art style or the magical fairy tale feel, I'm not really sure. This movie is probably what inspired my love of deep-sea creatures, though. If the movie feels segmented and episodic, it's because it was originally a 26-episode series in Japan. The English-dubbed movie release was cutting together of various episodes. I would love to see the complete series one day, but it's a pretty hard one to track down.
Let me be your wings. Let me lift you high above. Everything we're dreaming of will soon be ours.
I have an incredibly really strong nostalgia tie to this movie, even though, objectively speaking, it's not really all that great. It's not terrible, but I mean, it's kind of a Disney knockoff at its core. But I watched it so very much as a child that every song, line, piece of dialogue, and character design is so deeply ingrained in my psyche that they will never ever leave. This is the story of Thumbelina and her adventures as a tiny little person, full of romance, fairies, bugs, and a strange French singing bird. I guess I always did love the idea of tiny people, which was why I loved The Borrowers and stories about fairies and such, so Thumbelina was right up my alley. And to be honest, I absolutely adore all of the music in this film. It's hard to talk about Thumbelina without gushing about how pretty it all is. And even though I can look at it now and pick apart its flaws, it is nothing but happy memories for me.
Liberty, justice, trust, freedom, peace.
And lastly, Quest for Camelot. I know. Quest for Camelot is universally considered a terrible movie. I am well aware of its flaws and why it's bad. I still loved it. Yes, the two-headed dragon is annoying and obnoxious as all get out, and yes, the plot is full of incredibly gaping plot holes, and yes, the characters are contrived and flat. I still loved it. Kaylee was a heroine I could get behind as a young girl, and she was incredibly empowering to me. She was a tomboy, and she was feisty and heroic, even if she was totally stupid and naive. I liked Kaylee because I could relate to her, and she represented what I wanted to be. I loved the music in this, and I loved the medieval fantasy setting. It's probably pretty telling that 4 out of 5 titles on my list are fairy tale and fantasy. These sorts of movies as a kid shaped my taste in fiction and helped me grow into the nerd that I am today. I may have traded Quest for Camelot in for Game of Thrones, but in the end, it's all in the same family. Well, that's it for my top 5 animated films from my childhood list. I hope you enjoyed my little trip down memory lane. I know I sure had fun with it. Next week I'm going to get back into some more standard reviews, so I hope you come back for that. See you then. Bye.